I'd like to welcome everybody to this year's Neil Aggett Labour Studies Lecture. The Neil Aggett Labour Studies Lecture is an annual event organized to commemorate and remember the name of Neil Aggett, Dr. Neil Hudson Aggett, a trade unionist with close links to this town that is Makhanda, formerly Grahamstown. Neil Aggett died at the age of 28. Born in Kenya, he moved with his family to South Africa at the age of 10. He attended a school in Grahamstown, King's College, and he went on to study medicine at the University of Cape Town. He disapproved of the apartheid society in which he was raised. He rejected the advantages that came with being white and middle class. As a medical student, he served his internship at wretched black public hospitals in Umtata and Tembisa. He lived in a laborer's college while a student without water, hot water or electricity. After he completed his studies in 1977, he didn't become a wealthy medical practitioner. He didn't open the doors to a life of luxury and privilege. He worked at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, then Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto, the biggest of segregated black public hospitals of apartheid, a hospital overcrowded in the midst of a dense, grim, working class neighborhoods. He worked in the night shift there, believing that the ill health, the medical problems that people had, of those people he treated, were rooted in the oppressive social, economic and political conditions in which people lived. Working there at night, in the day, he spent his time as a trade union organizer. He volunteered initially at the Industrial Aid Society, which is Worker Support Center. He helped to establish a workmen's compensation unit, which dealt with workers' injuries at work. From 1978, he was actively involved in the African Food and Canning Workers Union. The African Food and Canning Workers Union had been established around the 1940s by leaders such as Oscar Peter, Ray Alexander. It had been a union which helped found the South African Congress of Trade Unions. It survived the repression of the 1960s, but had been badly damaged. He helped to reorganize it. He was not paid for his union work. After a long night at the hospital, he would spend his day working the union, catching sleep where he could. People who knew him from the time remembered him as a gentle, kind, and patient man, never putting himself in the forefront. He played a key role in setting up the branch of the African Food and Canning Workers Union at the Fatties and Monies factory in Johannesburg. The struggle there was part of a larger struggle which became a big community-supported boycott. This was an important part of the connections that were made in those days between trade unions and community-based struggles. Boycotts were a way that ordinary people could signal their support for worker struggles, and worker struggles were also used to support ordinary people. As the union became more involved in politics, as many unions did, and as the anti-apartheid movement grew, it attracted the attention of the apartheid government and its security branch. Regular sweeps of activists, he was caught up in one of these nets. And today, when we look back after 30 years of parliamentary democracy and think what didn't go right, let's just remember in those days, you could be detained without trial, without charge, indefinitely, with no contact with lawyers, no contact with family, no access to anything outside, subject completely to the wills of a brutal state. Neil was beaten, he was tortured, and in February 1982, at the age of 28, he died in prison. The police insisted he had committed suicide at the notorious John Foster Square in downtown Johannesburg. After 70 days, he became the 51st person to die in detention since 1963. And his death was seen as an attack on the new non-racial anti-apartheid trade union movement. His funeral was a mass event attended by around 40,000 people. The symbolism of Neil as somebody who gave everything everything for the unions was something which inspired people. The unions said, and this was the occasion for many unions from many different federations and traditions to come together in joint protest, organize a half-hour general strike, the first in South Africa in many years, organized by Labour. The unions which came together said, those who knew him well can say he was strong in mind and body. He knew he might one day be jailed, as so many other trade unionists had been detained, but he had nothing to fear. He said he feared nothing from detention. He was in good spirits and confident, and he knew there was no charge that could be brought against him. The union's work was public. The issues were discussed. The union was completely open. In fact, with the labor reforms of the time, the union had full legal rights. Yet he was caught up. The way our union works and the way Neil conducted himself, said the Food and Canning Workers Union. With that, we can never be expected to believe that Neil, for whatever reason, would kill himself. Quite recently, the inquest into Neil's death was reopened, and it has now been, after the cover-up in the 80s, fairly strongly established that Neil had been killed in prison. He is seen being dragged to his cell, unconscious, the cell in which he hanged himself later. As the Neil Aggett Labour Studies Unit, host of the Neil Aggett Labour Studies lecture, we try to commemorate his name, and we hope that we are able to work with some of the spirit that Neil had. We don't claim to stand in the same stature as people like Neil, but we can do our best. And all of you here, you know this, you can do your best. This is a world that is made by people, can be remade by people. Every one of us, all humanity, all suffering people, can make a difference. We don't have to keep facing the same problems. Now, with this in mind, I want you to say a quick thing about the Neil Aggett Labour Studies Unit and introduce our guest. The Neil Aggett Labour Studies Unit, based at Rhodes University at Makanda, formerly Grahamstown, is a non-aligned research and labour studies hub. We are engaged in policy research. We are engaged in advocacy work, and we are engaged in workers' education. And those who've worked with us know that our orientation is to support the working class movement. Don't support any particular group or faction. We understand that really the key issue that can be resolved is only the working class can free itself. So we don't substitute in any way. We don't take sides. We work with all working class formations. And when I say that, I don't just mean trade unions. We work with farm dwellers and farm workers. We work with the unemployed and community groups. We work with the self-employed. We work with those who often don't even consider workers. Now, one of the things we've been doing this week is we have a workers' school named after Vuyisi Limini. Vuyisi Limini was a trade unionist, another important reference for us. Active in what was then Port Elizabeth in the 1950s, known as Organized with the Unorganized, a songwriter, a poet, a singer, a member of the African National Congress and of the Underground Communist Party. He organized in what was then Port Elizabeth, on the docks, in the factories. In the 1960s, when the armed struggle began, he rose to a key post in Mkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, became East Cape Commander of MK, and in 1964, he was among several MK activists who were hanged by the apartheid state and buried in Potter's Field, that is to say, in paupers' graves in Pretoria, unmarked, so they couldn't be commemorated. Tonight's speaker is Professor Lloyd Sachikonye. I'm very pleased and honored that he made the trip here from Zimbabwe. Professor Lloyd has a very long and impressive CV. And for those working in the field of labor studies in Southern Africa, his name is very well known. So I'm going to, with your permission, Lloyd, mention some of the things that you've done. Lloyd Sachikonye is a professor emeritus, meaning he is a retired professor, but still active in the academic life of development studies at the University of Zimbabwe. He has published widely on African labor movements and on union, civil society, and the democracy struggle in Zimbabwe. His books include Striking Back, the Labor Movement in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe. This written with Brian Raptopoulos, and as you can see, co-published with the ZCTU, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, the Frederick Herbert Stockton and Weaver Press documents many of the struggles that workers in Zimbabwe have waged. A successor book, and this is the second in it. This is the second. There's a trilogy. I don't have the first one yet. Second book is Building from the Rubble, the labor movement in Zimbabwe since 2000. Again, edited with Raptopoulos, but also with Godfrey Kanyense. Other books he's written include Trade Unions and Party Politics, Labor Movements in Africa. That was done with Bjorn Beckman and Sakela Plungu. You may know Professor Plungu is Vice Chancellor these days at the University of Fort Hare. And besides this very busy man has written another book, When a State Turns on Its Citizens, 60 Years of Institutionalized Violence in Zimbabwe. He serves on the boards of the union-affiliated Labor and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Serves on the board of the Farm Community Trust of Zimbabwe. He serves on the boards of the Global Labor Journal, Review of African Political Economy, and other publications. So here's something recently he's produced. There's one last thing before I give Prof. Lloyd the podium. I also want to express our thanks to our partners, the Frederick Herbert Stockton, which has worked with us for many years on worker education. We have one representative, hey, Dr. Mabasa is there. And this is also an event that they have promoted and supported. So thank you very much. Without further ado, allow me to welcome Professor Sachikonye to the front. Thank you. In terms of format, Lloyd will give an address, and then we normally take some questions and answers, but it's very much now in his hands. When we get to that later stage, this questions and that also, we have people joining us online, they will also be able to engage. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucien. Thanks to the Aggett Labor Studies units at the University of Rhodes, thanks to the Uyisile Mini Workers School, thanks to the Frederick Aggett Foundation, the partners to the Aggett Labor Studies Center, comrades, ladies and gentlemen. I am profoundly grateful to have been honored to present this year's Aggett lecture, a lecture which honors the memory of Dr. Aggett, which honors his contribution and dedication to workers' struggles during the apartheid era. Those who detained and murdered him believed that they would silence him forever. They were mistaken. They did not succeed. His example lives on and inspires us and others. The significance of Dr. Aggett's sacrifice has transcended national boundaries. because the ideals that he lived for and fought for continue to inspire unions and workers' struggles, not only here in South Africa, but also across the region and beyond. My first visit to the Eastern Cape was in 1993. It was to present a paper at a workshop organized by Ben Turok, a respected ANC stalwart at that time, now led, as you know, who then led an institute for African alternatives. The venue was at Fort Hare, University of Fort Hare. I remember that workshop very well. I remember the electrifying atmosphere, the electrifying environment, high expectations of the democratic transition, which was just around the corner, now that apartheid was crumbling. The whole Southern African region, indeed the continent and the wider world, were excited that South Africa is just about to be free at last. In the struggle for that freedom and liberation, the labor movement in South Africa was a pivotal player in the mass mobilization of the 1980s and early 1990s. Your current solidarity of the sister labor movements in the region, indeed the wider world, had also contributed as well to that struggle. For instance, I remember many times that leaders of the mine workers union in the Southern African region used to meet on matters of fraternal interest and for strategizing. And I remember your current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who then led the mine workers union, National Mine Workers now, as some of you would remember. While a friend of mine called Jeffrey Dandare, now late, led the Zimbabwe counterpart of the Mine Workers Union, the Associated Mine Workers Union of Zimbabwe. They would often meet in Harare and Johannesburg, in solidarity meetings for strategizing. Those were the high days of solidarity between labor unions within our region that brought workers much closer together, brought trade unions much closer. Of course, looking back over those 30 to 40 years, so much has happened, not least in my own country of Zimbabwe, where I've spent most of my working life. A central player in the struggles for improved working and livelihood conditions has been the labor movement, especially for the 1990s, because those conditions were shaped by the wider political environment. The labor movement was also ineluctably drawn into politics, into struggles for democracy. As one union leader said, politics of the stomach cannot be separated from the politics of the state. It's a close connection between those two. The Zimbabwean struggles have been about to improve livelihoods and to enjoy the basic rights and political freedoms simultaneously. This lecture explores how and why workers through their labor movements have championed those twin struggles for better livelihoods and for democracy in the past 30 years. By livelihoods here we mean struggles for better livelihoods. We mean the means of securing necessities of life, the wages, struggle for better wages, better pensions, social safety nets, and so on. And they range from workplace activities, community, and informal sources of livelihoods. And by democracy here, we mean the broad representation and participation of citizens in the political system, but also access to basic economic rights and better livelihoods. While elections are important, are central to democracy, they do not amount to democracy on their own. It's not just about voting once every 5 years. Democracy is electoral democracy should be reinforced with wide economic and cultural participation. I remember a chapter I did with fellow Zimbabwean Lafmo Matombo to give you a context of where Zimbabwe is at this point in time. And I quote, on the face of it, Zimbabwe represents a paradox. It's a society that liberated itself from settler colonial rule through an arduous armed struggle, accompanied by high levels of political mobilization, in cities and towns, but also in the villages. And the level of consciousness rose high as a result of that struggle. However, more than 3 decades later, authoritarianism appears to have demobilized that conscious population, that wider population, to the extent that mobilization has been replaced by despondency, fear, apathy, and in some cases, withdrawal. End of quote. We also noted that 3 million, 20% of the Zimbabwean population, has chosen the exit option by emigrating to other countries, including to South Africa here, and also to other overseas destinations. Let us examine the narrative of how that state of affairs came to be after the goodwill and show of promise in the 1980s. Because at one point during that decade, the then Tanzanian president, Julius Nyerere, had described Zimbabwe as a jewel of a country when he visited it for the first time in 1980. It was the second most industrialized country on the continent in terms of economic development. But our narrative really begins in the 1990s. The Mugabe administration was then in power, but it was not competent at running the economy. It did not develop necessary skills during the liberation struggle in the 1970s. Nor had it demonstrated sufficient interest in developing skills to maintain and expand the inherited economy. Instead, by the first decade of independence, the economy was in crisis. Investment into the economy had shrunk alarmingly. This was the context in which the country adopted structural adjustments, a neoliberal system model of development. And this particular program was known as the Economic Structural Adjustment, or ESA. Sorry for that. trying to get used to this technology. We've already spoken about the Zimbabwe paradox. Let's go on to talk about this neoliberal structural adjustment program that I'm talking about, called ESAP in short, which began to be implemented in 1990. Like in most adjustment programs elsewhere in Africa, ESAP involved deep cuts in public sector employment, deep cuts in wages, cost of living allowances, and also cuts in key social services like education and health, on the advice of the typical usual suspects, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They insisted on austerity so that there would be economic growth towards an economic promised land. But the result was opposite. The ESAP resulted in a major shift in economic and social policy on the part of the Mugabe government and ruptured the unwritten social contract between the state and organized labor and business. While the rupture and reached a few elites, it resulted in the worsening of the conditions of the majority of the working and middle classes in the country. In hindsight, the adoption of adjustment in the early 1990s was a defining watershed in Zimbabwe's political economy. The early critics of ESAP argued that full-blown economic liberalization would undercut domestic industries before they were strong enough, before they had been able to re-equip and reinvest substantially. Furthermore, the hasty deregulation of labor laws and social safety measures would cause a widespread backlash. Indeed, a process of deindustrialization took place as a result of this new neoliberal approach. Because of liberalization, the country was opened up to floodgates of imports, cheap imports from other countries. And as a result, you had industries such as textiles, clothing, metals, suffering because of the competition that came about, as a result of the opening up before the local industries were strong enough to be able to compete effectively. In the sectors such as textiles and clothing, there's a substantial contraction as a result of the competition that I was talking about. But the backlash from the workers and the unions was bound to happen. And it took the form of prolonged strikes in the public sector in 1996, followed by national general strikes in 1997 and 1998. All this is a reflection of the fact that by the 1990s, the labor movement was much stronger. It was based on strong industrial unions as a result of the measures that had occurred in the 1980s. Unions had also developed stronger collective bargaining skills. It set up departments for research, to be able to do legal work within the unions. They were much better organized than they had been before. So they were able to organize and resist the neoliberal ESAP program. So we had a process where there was an upsurge in militants amongst the workers. And they were involved, of course, in campaigning against production politics and social consumption politics and the deregulation that we have been talking about. And the labor movement was in such place, central place, where it was able to, it could not shy away from articulating the connections between what was happening in the economy and what was happening in the political arena. It could not afford to be detached at all. And this was the issue that dominated the 1990s in Zimbabwe. From the perspective of the labor movement, the economic crisis could not be solved by economic solutions alone. By 1998, the movement leadership had set in sights at broadening its alliances. It could not resist ISOP alone. It had to resist it together with other classes, other strata within society. And in one of their meetings, and I quote, the ZCTU, for example, conveyed the minutes of that meeting, 1998, conveyed a keen sense of the developments, and I quote, they said, people from all walks of life, not necessarily workers, are crying out for salvation from the labor movement. Labor should therefore seriously consider and understand the concern of the men and women in the streets. There's need to seriously consider going beyond the worker and integrate ordinary people. Workers' issues have become community issues. As such, linkages and networking with other civic groups is important. We should be able to control and direct the emerging social movement to maintain, show clearly what direction to take. And of course, this was the broad context in the ZCTU consciously broadened its unionism into what was called social movement unionism. This brand of unionism entailed embracing other social groups with respect to their social, economic, and political interests. And this found expression in the ZCTU's leadership of the constitutional reform movement, the National Constitutional Assembly in 1998, whose founding chairs were Morgan Tsvangirai, Secretary General of the ZCTU, and his deputy, who was Gibson Sibanda at that time, and various civil society organizations also then constituted the broad membership of the labor movement at that time. The vision of the NCA, this constitutional reform movement, because the old constitution was no longer relevant as far as the interests of the broader section of the country was concerned. The view of the NCA was that without good governance founded on a firm foundation of a democratic constitution, efforts at development would not go far or come to naught. The NCA was tapping into a growing disillusionment with the limitations of the independence constitution that had been negotiated some 20 years or so earlier. The constitution, that constitution had become an obstacle to the broad democratization process in the country. By now, the labor movement had ended national politics because there was a vacuum. It had ended politics because of the deficits in the constitution, deficits in economic governance, deficits in political governance. I remember in 1998 working with Brian Raftopoulos interviewing Morgan Tsvangirai, now late, for the book we were writing on the labor movement. A charismatic leader, he was developing a vision beyond the movement, beyond the labor movement, to one of a broad leadership of a national democratic movement. The labor movement's leading role in that constitutional assembly propelled it further into the leadership, consciously or unconsciously, leadership of opposition politics. It had succeeded in creating formidable political alliance that included unions, women's organizations, churches, human rights organizations, students, youth organizations, NGOs, and intellectuals. At its peak, the NCA had 96 organizations. It was a national organization with clear objectives, primarily, of course, to change the content, to change the parameters of independence, of governance. Through its activities between 1998 and 1999, the governance question entered the everyday arena of everyday politics, while it channeled the discussion on economic issues towards the crisis of the state. Let's talk a little bit now about the link between working conditions, livelihoods, and democratic space. The late 1990s did not witness improvement in the economy or in the conditions of livelihoods. Due to inflation, the value of salaries and wages shrank, prices of basic commodities and services soared beyond the reach of the average worker. For the first time since independence, there was an outbreak of food riots. Food riots in some of the cities and towns in 1998. Thousands protested against increased prices of maize meal and bread. And for the first time as well, the military was called in to assist the police in putting those riots. It did not escape the attention of workers and consumers at that time. But in fact, the Zimbabwe state was spending $300 million a year on its military intervention in the Congo, the DR Congo. Only a few citizens benefited from that expensive intervention, namely the military and the political elites benefited through the contracts that they had, some companies that were exploiting minerals and timber and other commodities in the Congo. So they got rich through intervening in the Congo, while the rest of the country, not in fact, because of the diversion of funds, public services, education, health suffered as a result. The country was not only in dire economic straits, but there were grumblings from various strata of society. Example from the war veterans, who had played an important part in the war, began to demand payback for the role that they played in the liberation struggle. And when the state panicked in granting the veterans huge payouts and pensions, the Zimbabwe dollar crashed in 1997. A crash that it has never been able to recover from up to the present. This was the immediate context in which the labor movement was leading the push for constitutional reform and for the widening democratic space, as we have already observed. But a key landmark in that was the founding by the ZCTU of what it called the National Working People's Convention. The convention that brought together people from urban, peri-urban, and rural areas, representing unions, organizations, the informal sector, churches, human rights organizations, students, and so on. In other words, a broad national democratic movement. Some of the issues that they raised were, of course, the severe decline in incomes, employment, health, and food security. The issue of the unfair burden borne by working women and the persistence of gender discrimination. Also raised the issue of the decline in public services, social services, but also access to water, better roads, and so on. But they also raised the issue of widespread corruption and lack of public accountability in economic and political institutions. More strategically, that convention resolved to set up a democratic political movement for change, and in 1999, that resulted in the formation of a labor-supported movement for democratic change, the MDC, that you began to hear about in the late 1990s and the 2000s. That MDC was under the leadership of Morgan Tsvangirai. It was a multi-class alliance. It had workers, but it also had employers, large-scale farmers, small-scale farmers, professionals and technicians, lawyers, academics, students, youth, and many more groups. It had now widened even beyond just that broad alliance I was talking about, because it was showing that it was a dynamic movement, various other social forces that do not naturally get into democratic movements also did so, taking advantage of the political wave that had been started by the MDC. The larger question, however, was whether the labor movement would continue to be the key player within that MDC, whether it would continue to be the dominant force within the MDC, or whether these other classes, these other groups would actually, with time, be able to marginalize labor from that early position of initiation of the movement. But that did not discourage the MDC from strategizing for elections in 2000 and 2008, in which it did quite well. First, in a referendum in which they defeated a government-sponsored constitutional draft that had not taken into account what the people really wanted to be contained in the constitution. But also in the parliamentary elections that took place in the year 2000, where the opposition came very close to upsetting that election in 2000. And then finally in 2008, where the MDC actually won the majority of the seats in parliament, and where, in fact, there's strong suspicion that the opposition had actually also won the presidency if there had not been a heavy rigging that took place at that time. But even then, there were already some fault lines within the political movement and formidable threats from an authoritarian state and its multiple agencies. Labour made up 21% of those who were in the MDC component in parliament. The rest, more than 70%, were held by other groups or representatives of other groups, lawyers, academics, professionals, businessmen and large farmers, and so on. And it would not take long before some businessmen and academics sought to take the party in neoliberal direction, or even engineer a split. But let us assess how Labour's success up to then provoked the backlash from ZANU-PF and its state. Let's just remind ourselves what the authoritarian backlash consisted of. The backlash was, of course, because they did not want, they felt that the labor movement was too strong. The MDC was too strong. And so they sponsored a rival labor federation, the Zimbabwe Federation of Trade Unions, is a rival to the ZCTU, as way of undermining the vibrant ZCTU. And they wanted to deregister the ZCTU. They failed. They took it to the courts, and they failed to do so. And it was in the 2000s that the full backlash of the state was unleashed against the labor movement in the MDC. And it's a backlash that continues up to this day. The labor movement represented the most formidable force in civil society against assaults and living standards and democratic rights in the post-2000s period. By and large, its political weight was still undiminished. This is why the Mugabe administration waged a systematic and relentless attack against it. The government was nervous because they saw the unions as a possible vehicle to change, as it happened in Zambia under Chiluba in the early 1990s. And therefore, you had a lot of unions were targets for a number of reasons. They were viewed as bedfellows of MDC and were accused of having provided infrastructure and other forms of support to it. For example, the ZCTU's national presence through offices and branches and organizers in cities, towns, and regions was a major facilitating asset. Particular union infrastructure and organizers were seen by the governing party as a major political threat and therefore an object of attack. Examples included the murder of some union activists, including Talent Chiminya, arson attacks, union offices in Bulawayo, repeated raids on the ZCTU head office in Rare. So unions were viewed as incubators of the new breed of politicians with strong roots in both workplaces and communities. The ZCTU was required to apply for police permission to hold when it wanted to hold public meetings, but most of the time that permission was refused. When the courts ruled that such a law as POSA contradicted the basic right to freedom of assembly, the government crafted what it called the Criminal Codification Act to tighten repression, thus making it a serial offender against basic freedoms and civil liberties. A number of key events illustrate the pattern of repression. Between 2001 and 2008, was a strike at steelworks called ZISCO at Redcliffe, for example, in 2001. That strike witnessed the shooting dead of 4 miners and the injuring of 22 in a strike, in a kind of our own version of the Marikana incident. The second was in 2003 when unions gathered to protest against basic commodity prices and so on, resulting in tension, the number of leaders and officials. Perhaps no episode in the annals of repression was as emblematic as the torture of ZCTU leaders in September 2006. This was to punish the leaders for participating in a nationwide demonstration against the government's economic policies. And a commission was appointed at that time by the International Labour Organization to investigate that torture incident. The relentless onslaught on the leadership and membership of unions had profound consequences for their capacity to regroup and sustain pressure on the state. So by the end of the 2000s, by the end of that decade, some unionists spoke of a strong sense of fear and insecurity and an overwhelming threat of harassment and violence. The movement's resources have been depleted by the cost of legal fees, bail fines, provisions of food for detained unionists, transport costs, and so on. Let me skip on to talk about the more current period, which begins, I think, in 2017 with the coup. That, as you remember, marked the coming into power of the Second Republic under Mnangagwa. Before I conclude, I think we see certain patterns in authoritarianism. As a result, of course, there were different interpretations of the coup. Some called it a military-assisted transition, but others saw it for what it was, which was the overthrowing of Mugabe, who had spent 37 years in office. Just imagine, 3 decades, more than 3 decades in power. But I think it gives you a sense of how strong the authoritarian grip there was on that system. And of course, when the Second Republic came into office, it made some promises to turn around the economy, to stabilize conditions, to reopen links with other countries, particularly in the West, and become less authoritarian. But the reality, as we know, has been different. It has been more of the same. For all its slick publicity and public relations advisors, the Mnangagwa government has not done much better than the previous administration. Because on the political front, there has been notable regression. For example, in the 2018 election, that election did not end well. There were 6 protesters who were killed on the streets of Harare. And there was an inquiry under your former president, Shande, because it was a disputed election. From that time onwards, I think the true colors of the Second Republic became clearer. You had instances of shootings of protesters around economic issues. You also had the kind of a repeat in the 2023 elections last year. Cases of irregularities, rigging, even the SADC election observer team also came to quite critical conclusions about how that election was handled. But more than that, I think one can point to a kind of excessive use of the law, weaponizing of the law by the state to crush or to weaken the opposition, not just the main opposition, but also civic groups in that country. You have now new legislation like the private voluntary organizations bill to control civic society organizations, particularly those who are involved in governance and human rights work. You have the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act, which penalizes criticism, even mild criticism, political leadership. Also have the Patriotic Act, which punishes acts that have been described as willful injuring sovereignty and national interests, among other issues. And there are other worrying examples of the erosion of democratic space, particularly in the past 3-4 years. For example, unionists, including labor unionists, have been arrested while arriving back from international seminars. Arrests of journalists around with exposed corruption by the higher ups. And there's a notorious case of an MP who was thrown in for 595 days, the case of Joe Sikala. And more recently, in June, we had 64 opposition members who were meeting to celebrate Day of African Child were arrested and they're still in jail. They've not been given the choice to pay bail, for example. A more notorious case recently in August, where a young unionist, the teachers union and others were pulled out of a plane at Harare Airport and tortured for some time before they were released. You get such cases where the state seems to be much more vicious. I mean, I think betraying its nervousness about any criticism, its nervousness regarding any organized groups that are pressing for their rights or pressing for democratic change in the country. But I think the larger context in which this is happening, this authoritarian repression is occurring in Zimbabwe, is that also globally, there seems to be what has been called a democratic recession rollback, where it has become fashionable in some countries to say that democracy is not the most critical thing. You don't eat democracy. You don't eat it, so why should you press for democratic rights? Is it not enough that we maybe just make sure you have food on the table? And China, of course, has been pushing that developmental authoritarianism in countries such as Rwanda and others. And I think this is the context in which leaders such as Mnangagwa and Zimbabwe are also saying that maybe this is a path that we should, that country should follow. What's more important is infrastructure. We have new roads, new airports, and a few other. That should be enough. That's progress, not this democracy thing that you are pushing. But that's a dangerous idea. It's a dangerous agenda. You do not live on food alone, also live freedom. You need both development, material development, and freedom. I think I should therefore wind up, but of course, one is to say what should be done. Should it just be this sort of gloomy prognosis that I have presented, or that could be, what are the solutions? Yes, in conclusion. Of course, the neoliberal context is with us. It's, the African countries are operating within that environment. It's a context of the powerful institutions that I began talking about, the IMF and the World Bank, in the case of Zimbabwe. Thank you. And it's a difficult environment. But I think countries and societies need to exercise some actions of some kind, not just adapt hook, line, and sinker what is recommended by those powerful institutions. So the question is, how can we organize for that agency to be exercised? Certainly, we saw in the case of Zimbabwe that labor was an active player, was not passive at all when ISAP was imposed. Sought to modify it, sought to create some alliances that would push for a better agenda. And also beyond that, the opening up democratic space in that country for over 10 years or so, more or less, succeeded. So remember in 2008, led to its electoral victory, which resulted in a government of national unity, some until 2014. But at the same time, although Labour can form those alliances, I think it also made some one or two mistakes in the process. All its leadership went into power, but then joined government, left few able people within to continue within the group, continue to push, continue to strengthen. I think there is a lesson there. You need some kind of balance in terms of skills and leadership. Not all of them should go into politics or into elected office, because you need to maintain the vibrance, dynamism of people. So the issue of strategizing, and also the regional context, since it brings up the issue of solidarity. I began by talking about the much closer or denser solidarity there used to be in the 1990s. I think that solidarity has sort of weakened now, but you need that solidarity within the region so that if things not working in another country, should be solidarity with those who are trying to push for change in that particular country. Of course, within Zimbabwe itself, the movement, the labor movement, is to broaden its alliances even further. Need to broaden those alliances, do more work in the villages, farming areas. Many small farmers now, lands, their areas there, issues on which labor and the small farmers can strategize around. But also the demographics are changing. The young, as elsewhere in Africa, the majority now, reaching out to them in terms of mobilizing broad scenario. And then the new technologies, various new technologies that themselves, innovative ways of using them to strengthen the movement and the alliances. And I think on that note, probably can draw this talk to the end. Maybe I overrode it in terms of minutes, but I hope there's sufficient issues that are raised that can form a basis for more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. What we're going to do, and I don't know if you maybe just want to run it yourself, but we'll take some questions from the house, and we'll also call out some if they're from the online people, because we're also joined online by nearly 30 people. And I can see that we also are drawing on people from around the world and from other cities. I can see a Nigerian comrade there. I can see a comrade based in Switzerland. Oh, this is fantastic. So, Lloyd, thanks very much. Let's come on. Let's give it. So I suggest what we do is people just put up your hand and maybe Lloyd take 2 or 3 questions, address them, and then we take another round. If we can do it that style of rounds. And comrades, when you ask questions, maybe ask that you just introduce yourself briefly, not the CV, but just who you are, where you're coming from. I think it's important context for these discussions. Just put up your hand. I think good.
Prof, thanks very much for quite an exciting information and from the National Council of Trade Unions. You mentioned in your presentation that when the MDC itself, led by workers, got into parliament, 21% was worker leadership. However, there was a split because there were problems that were different. And the lawyers, professionals, academia, it became a split. Now I want to understand as to what would your advice be in light of those developments that workers themselves who led the process towards a change in Zimbabwe found themselves in a situation where between them and the academics, people that they thought they were together in the struggle, an imminent split happened. Then what should be the way to go?
Thank you, comrade. What was the next step? I'm going to take 4 people. Okay, I'm going to take them geographically. Start with comrade here.
Thanks, Prof. And to everyone who's here and abroad. This is Nkololi Gildaba, coming from PSA, one of the unions here in South Africa. Prof, you are giving us a very sad situation indeed. We are so ashamed indeed that one of our brothers is under such a persecution. I'm talking about people of Zimbabwe. Mine is about the role of the SADC. It is so unfortunate that we have a body called SADC. Practically, one can say it's a toothless boat where you cannot define its role as to what it is that it can do for the benefit of our countries here in Southern Africa. It failed, we saw it in Zimbabwe. It never assisted it. And I wish we can explore it more further as to why we still have that thing. Why is it existing? Because it is indeed, I listened to Professor Lumumba from Kenya the other time, looking at the functioning of SADC and the failures that it demonstrates. So I'm saying, I think the SADC nations, they need to look at it again as to, is it still relevant to have that thing here? And the last one, so that I can sit down. Do you still have a currency in Zimbabwe? Thank you.
I'll take the comrade first, and I'll take comrade.
Okay. What's one is we have in Makan, two people a revolution against Mugabe. It was people of Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF. So I want to know how Mnangagwa managed to spin it to be anti-Mugabe and then appear as a hero. Whereas we know that he was there since the beginning. So how did he spin that one? Secondly, I suppose you will correct me if I'm behind facts, but the last time I checked, for Zimbabweans who live outside Zimbabwe, who vote in Zimbabwe was compared to Zimbabwe. Now, how far are the lawmakers in changing that? Because the majority to ZANU-PF lives outside Zimbabwe. So if that's still the case today, it simply means ZANU-PF is happy wherever it is. So until the opposition, which is outside of Zimbabwe, takes part in the democratic process of Zimbabwe. So how far the lawmakers are in changing that scenario?
Thank you very much, Dawiti Sifundo Kusan. Thank you very much, Prof, for the profound deliverance. My two questions, or one question, would be that: would you say, Prof, neoliberalism and monarchism dictatorship is mastering the art of service in the society than the democracy itself? You will see that in China, it's working. Rwanda, it's working. Swaziland, it's working. So can you give a clear direction which one would be preferred for the poor of the poorest and the voiceless of the voiceless? That's my only question, Prof. Thank you very much.
So thank you, comrade. I think we've put a lot on Prof. Lloyd's plate. So, Prof, we will hand over to you to answer, and then when you're done, we will maybe take another round.
Thank you very much for very thoughtful questions, comrades. I think the first question has to do with the experience of a Labour-led party that goes into parliament or into a position of power. And as time goes on, elements within that movement weaken it, either through fragmentation or through changing its ideological, its economic program. I think what this calls for or suggests is that a Labour-led movement really has to be strong regarding its ideological basis and orientation. It has to be clear about its strategic direction. Of course, any labor movement that wants or that has the ambition with the new government cannot consist only of labor. It has to draw in other groups and other classes. I think what's primary here, what becomes important, is the program. What kind of program it would be having once it is in power. I think earlier in the morning we were talking of different positions, social democratic position, nationalist position, and so on. And I think if here we are talking about a party that's clear about where it's going, builds a party, strong principles and guidelines. But also, I think, capacity to ensure that its policies, its vision is dominant. Of course, it might mean negotiating with those other groups in society. I think that's important, rather than just leave it, in other words, you have to convert the movement into a party, a kind of political party with a program, a constitution, clear direction in terms of where it is going. I think what happened in the case of the MDC in Zimbabwe is that you had so many forces with different interests. You had your large-scale commercial farmers who wanted to hang on to land, who were not very keen on the redistribution of land, for example. You had business interests who, in fact, advocated, the neoliberal path. And so you had different voices, a kind of a tower of Babel within the movement. And so what's important becomes important is the framework. It's a framework that various groups have to agree to in order for the party to proceed. And in the case of the MDC, I think there's a case of a business who he was called Eddie Cross, for example, and in his packages or in his and he was quite influential in terms of economic policy. And when the fragmentation came in MDC, he was one of the first to join, to be the advisor to the president of the Second Republic, and now he is actually writing a book on the president, obviously supporting his various positions. The role of SADC can do better. I think originally it started as a solidarity organization in its earlier form. With the frontline states, you might remember, in the late 1970s. It's pushing for the liberation of the remaining colonial territories. And the idea, of course, was to increase the space for political freedom and development. But I think what has happened since is that it's become more of a club, of the heads of state. Nobody talks about really what's happening in the other country, even if it is worrying. Even if there are detentions and killings, as the case in Swaziland or Zimbabwe or more recently in Mozambique. And yet, they have a framework, they call it the SADC guidelines and principles for democratic elections. And all of the countries signed that to declare that they would follow those principles and guidelines and respect them. But what we see is a kind of systematic violation of those, even when they're observer missions like they did in the case of Zimbabwe, issue observations about what happened and make recommendations. Instead of accepting those recommendations in good faith, what you actually have is emotional response, for example, to the report by Dr. Mumba, who headed the SADC observer mission last year, and so I think citizens or voters within the region, I think, have a right to make their voices heard on this. In any case, I think the ideal is to make SADC not just a SADC at the top, but SADC at the bottom. Citizens contributing to it, people-to-people exchanges, solidarity within the region. And so, in any case, historically, this is a region in which there's been a lot of integration at various levels, social, economic, and so on. So citizens have to find their space. They have to find their space, even if it means advising their governments about what they should do. Yes, we still have a currency in Zimbabwe. It's we have a lot of gold, as you know. Very small mines, but also some large mines. And we have chosen to call the latest currency Zimbabwe gold or Z. I think for 5 months it was quite stable. But I think the problem is that when there's time, or when it comes time for the government to pay for whatever contracts it would have given out, like this time they did some roads because there were some SADC heads of state coming in. They even built some villas. Some impressive structures and so on. But they needed to be paid, and I think there was some printing, some overtime printing in order to pay those contractors. And once that happens, it gets known, and the currency just. And I think that's what has been happening over time. There's little dispute, I think, on part of the state. It could do better, and it could then make the currency more stable. I think we have sufficient minerals, not just the gold, but also platinum, lithium, chromium, diamonds, and so in terms of natural resources, the country is very wealthy. It's a question of how that wealth is used. And there's much illicit outflows to other parts of the world, not just to China, but also to the Middle East. And there are that money just was instead of being used to redevelop the country. Regarding how the Second Republic, how he was able to give a different face, how Nagaga was able to keep it. The justification was that Mugabe was now very old. I think he was 93 or so, and his own wife was campaigning to be the next head of state, and she was, of course, the leader of a faction within ZANU-PF itself. And when Mnangagwa came in with, of course, the assistance of the military, The claim was that they were coming in to clean up the system. They were coming in to put things right. They were coming in to re-engage with other parts of the world, and so it was, I think, an example of factionalism at work, and different factions having different agendas. The diaspora vote, you're quite right. I think Zimbabwe is maybe the only country within the region that doesn't facilitate, doesn't grant rights to Zimbabweans outside to be able to vote while they're resident in that country. And as you explained, I think it's because of the nervousness of what could happen if those millions of Zimbabweans, those 3 million plus minus, how they could vote in any election. Most of them they've left for both either political or economic reasons, and they would like some change to happen. So this is why I think the ruling party is really dragging its feet on electoral reform, or reforming the electoral system so that Zimbabweans can exercise their right to vote wherever they are in the world, just like other countries do. The contradiction that is there is that they're so ready to accept the dollars or the rands from Zimbabweans who are outside. And the economy really thrives on those remittances, almost $2 billion now, which is almost more than foreign direct investment. So why not give them the right to vote as well, rather than just acknowledge that they are sending in some. About authoritarianism and democracy. I think in the last analysis, it's the citizens of any country to decide what kind of government or what kind of system they would like. Should they live under a one-party state system as China, where the right to form parties is not encouraged? Or should they have the right to do so, just like another country? You mentioned Swaziland. From time to time, there's turmoil in that country. Does it make a stable system? So I think the debate goes, and you'll find that authoritarians, of course, stress the material aspects of Democrats, stress that both are important. Both are important for societies and for countries. I think we can take another.
Okay, right. I think we can take another round. Please indicate. Noted 1, 2. People who've already, I'm not giving anyone 2 bites in the case. So 1, 2, maybe another 1 or 2 will pop up. 3, 4. Okay, we covered. I'm gonna just go by direction in the room.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Noble benefit, Sakau Kosatu. Prof, after listening to your talk, one cannot escape the feeling of hopelessness for the people of Zimbabwe. What I want to ask you, Professor, is even South Africa as new political climate. And with regards to the GUN, yes, that one. And how it further marginalizes the working class. And then South Africa being one of the strongholds in the SADC nations. How do you think of Zimbabwe will fare in this new political sphere or new political climate? Where do Zimbabweans or the working class of Zimbabweans now fit in the hierarchy or in the sphere of it all? With that being, we've hit a minor setback in the class struggle.
Thank you.
My name is Nobulelo Nzima from Communication Workers Union and SATU. My question is that why the Zimbabweans are living the place in terms of and then about the infrastructure and the growth for the action plan. What is it, the development there?
Thanks, Prof. My name is Malasa from DPS. So I have one question, and it's related to the relationship between the ruling regime and the character of the capitalist classes in Zimbabwe over time. So obviously, when the structural adjustment program was being implemented in the subsequent resistance, there must have been some support from the capitalist class for the regime, and possibly even into the period of authoritarianism. But what I'm trying to understand is, was there a shift in the character of that capitalist class over time in these two different periods between the structural adjustment period and the shift to authoritarianism?
Okay, yeah, that is, I think it's a good presentation. Thanks, Paul. And I think that it gives us, despite the gloomy picture that we are painting about Zimbabwe, there's a reason for hope in our context. What strikes me is that you seem to center labor again, and suggesting that we couldn't have change without the centrality of labor and union movement. For Zimbabwe, it's even richer because of the small industrial base, right? Where labor movement is relatively smaller than you find in South Africa. It's because here in this country there is a tendency, and I think that is quite problematic in my view, to decenter labor, to think that you can have social change without labor, and I would want to have a comment.
So we will ask Professor Sachikonye to reply to those last questions, and I believe also make some closing remarks. So I think it's another rich round and another full plate for Prof.
Oh, these are brilliant questions to begin with. You're quite right that relatively speaking, the Zimbabwean working class is relatively small. In fact, somewhere in the paper where I say that because of the economic decline in the 2000s, the 2010s, you had about 1.5 million workers in the formal sector at the beginning of the 2000s. By the end of the 2000s, that working class, in the formal sector was about 700,000, 800,000. because of the severe decline in the economy in the 2000s, almost 40% of the economy had been wiped off as a, combination of factors, the disruption from the land reform that occurred at the beginning of the 2000s, but also migration of capital. And then you added on to that sanctions, which made it difficult to get investment from outside, get grants, and so on. But what has expanded within that period is the informal economy, expanded phenomenally. Almost 80% of those people who work are in that informal economy across a whole range of sectors. Crafts, making of, whether it's metalwork, furniture, goods and services, and so on. And those products have also been increasing in terms of quality. So you have an small and medium enterprise sector, which is quite dynamic now. And the level of skills has also been growing. And there are some organizations also within that sector. We're not just talking about the crafts unions, but also, vendors, cross-border traders, and so on. And the professional class as well, young graduates who are into all kinds of openings within the services and so on. And there have been attempts to link these together with those who are in the formal sector. So there certainly is some hope there. The need is recognized to link up so that those sectors can be strengthened. And despite the problems, the labor movement, despite the fragmentation, despite the contraction of some of the unions' membership, they're still quite fairly strong. Regarding the business class, you're certainly right that there has been some expansion and contraction. Part of the landed business class, which was racially structured at one point in time. This has now changed. It's both few white farmers with days, but we also now have black farmers, large commercial, and also medium scale farmers. And in mining, you've also gotten an influx of mainly indigenous companies also getting into gold being one of the areas, gold mining, that they've gotten into. But also areas like tourism, construction, and so on. So I think you have had some expansion of the business of the business class, but you've also had some cartels that have emerged. Cartels that are well connected to the state. When we talk about some contracts that have been used for quick enrichment, we find people have received contracts but they have not delivered at all. If you go through what's going through the courts, there's so many of those cases. So you have pseudo business a kind of a pseudo business class that which has become fairly wealthy because of the connections with the state, and it's the average consumer, the average citizen, who has suffered as a result of the predatory character of that class. What about infrastructure in Zimbabwe? There certainly have been some new things done, or at least some renovation of airports or some of the major highways, new dams, so on. One cannot argue that there hasn't been done much. But I think they could do more. People talk about things like pipelines, water pipelines in the Livelihoods provinces. There's an old pipeline there. They've tried to promise to have water for nearly a century now. They are not even halfway at this stage. They're digging out. They could do that and make a lot of difference in that part of the world, including saving cities like Bulawayo and so on. There is something happening, but maybe it's not enough at all because of the deficits that the economic situation is that such that particularly for the young graduates, the young school leavers, unless they get into the informal economy and learn new skills, there's very little openings in the public or in the formal sector. This is why most of them leave, not just for the neighboring countries, but also for overseas countries, countries like Ireland, Canada, the US, and so on. They at least have the basic intellectual skills that they get from technical colleges and from university, and they can be readily, after orientation and so on, they can be rapidly absorbed in those labor markets, whether in the UK, Germany, Ireland, so which is a loss to the country, because to Zimbabwe, because they could be investing their skills, their labor, and contributing to the wealth, taxes to Zimbabwe, and so on. But I think those are the imperatives, that there are these contradictions in our economic policies, in our education policies, that we train thousands and thousands at our universities. There are more than 10 or so of those universities. We churn out those graduates. Only a tiny fraction can be employed. Finally, the issue of hopelessness. I think some would argue that there's some hopefulness about Zimbabwe. I'm talking of those young people. A large percentage of them are quite educated, but probably they are lacking skills, capital that they need to really, become innovative and begin to set up within the country. And within civil society, there's also, I think, optimism that they can keep on organizing. And sooner or later, the push, the spirits to change things will grow. And when the people begin to demand, when the time comes, it may be difficult to hold. So I think we still have hope. We have hope that Zimbabweans have within them that hope, that skill to change things for the better. Because even on an individual level, you find that initiative. Things are so high, but you find that level of initiative. Young people, women, single parents, so some are into cross-border trade, some are craftswork and so on for survival. But I think capacity, the scaling up, I think will okay. I think the course will change. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give Professor Sachikonye. Again, thank you for coming here, traveling from Harare. Last, it's a couple of connection flights, then the shuttle to this small town. But I think this is what you speak about. It's not just an issue of interest to Zimbabweans. It's an interest to us as citizens of the world, to us as working class movements. And I think it's been an eye opener for many of us. I think what Comrade Klubi was talking about how the narrative is managed. And in this case, I think a lot of South Africans, a lot of us were given the wrong impression of what was happening. And maybe, you know, we need to reflect on that. I want to just say one more thing, which is just please remember, you know, in Zimbabwe, there's no welfare grant system like we have here. The police brutality and that is harsh. You know, people are arrested without bail. Mentioned an MP, talking it's from Parliament, who was in jail for nearly 2 years, never fully tried, just can't pay no bail. So let's just remember that when you meet someone who's come from another country, to understand where they're coming from. It's true, like Prof said, that it's also a loss to countries when their own people have to go abroad. You end up subsidizing the West with the brain drain. And I'm sure many people don't want to have to flee. So let's just see that as fellow humans. Let's one more round of applause. Thank you very much. We're now closing this. There will be a recording online at some point. And if you are one of the people joining us by Zoom, if you drop your email into the Zoom chat, we will add you to our mailing lists. Right. So thank you very much. Good night.